Hello, my dear listeners. This is Irina. Welcome to my channel on Norse culture and Germanic languages, also contemporary aspects of Scandinavian and German society. Today, a little bit on Old Norse-Icelandic sagas, and more precisely on how we can categorize them. So, when discussing the Icelandic sagas, so these stories about people, mostly Scandinavian people, and their doings and happenings, it is also necessary to discuss the different types of sagas that exist. But this issue of classification is not quite an easy one, because we may attempt to divide them in some groups and subgroups according to the references in medieval texts as well as the writings of medieval scholars. But we must also say that the saga in itself is a mixed literary form, and individual sagas cannot always be cleanly assigned to this or that category. So we should bear that in mind in the first place. So regarding the terms used by medieval writers first to describe the sagas, by the way, both medieval writers and modern scholars tend to classify them according to the subject matter, but in medieval terminology, this is a little trickier. So we have medieval written evidence, for example, for the existence of the so-called Konungasogur, the sagas of kings, as well as Jarlasogur, the sagas of jarls. So we have the former referring mainly to the kings of Norway, and the latter referring to the members of the elites in the Orkney Islands, for example. You're also going to find something called Lygisogur. This is the lying sagas. This refers to sagas which are rather mythical and legendary, and people were kind of aware of that. We have, for example, in Thorgils saga og Halflida, a reference to these kinds of stories told at a wedding in 1119 in Reykjaholar, stories about berserkers, Vikings, stuff more or less in the realm of the fantastic, such as breaking into burial mounds, recovering treasures of some kind, and it is what the modern scholars describe as the mythical sagas, or the sagas of the ancient times, the Fornaldrarsogur. I'm going to come back to this a bit later. So the modern term, this Fornaldrarsogur, is probably in reference to a title given to an edition of this kind of saga, of mythical sagas, made by Carl Christian Ravn in the early 19th century. Emphasizing the fact that these sagas treat subject matters belonging to the, let's say, pre-Viking age or prehistoric age, if we were to compare it to the historical development in Iceland. And this term, Lygisogur, refers to some properties of the sagas, their lack of truth, their lack of historical truth, and although entertaining, it also implies the fact that you shouldn't probably rely on it, on such a story, more than this idea of entertainment. Yeah. So another term which is very similar to Lygisogur, it's the term Skrokksaga, or plural Skrokksogur. This can also be translated as fictitious story. It is sometimes used in medieval texts to translate the Latin fabula, so a fictional narrative. So we don't actually know for sure how widely these terms were used, but their presence in the medieval record betrays some kind of sensitivity related to this idea of a fictional story, which was comparable to general medieval ideas on the subject. It was a little bit more pronounced, so to speak. A very interesting term you're also going to find when looking in medieval texts is stjúpmæðrasogur hjarðarsveinar segja. Sagas of stepmothers that shepherd boys tell. Now, if you're under the impression that this sounds a little bit pejorative, you are not far away from the truth. We can find this term, for example, in an Icelandic translation of a work originally written in Latin. It is the work of a monk writing about Olaf Tryggvason. The term saga is used here, but it rather means a tale, so it's kind of like a subgenre of the saga, and it refers to a kind of popular story, rather told by low-class people, so the kind who are represented in saga literature as these people always engaging in spreading rumors and superstition. So it doesn't imply an author who was a member of the elite or a cultivated character. Well, modern classifications are based on the criteria of either subject matter or chronology. It's a little different than what the medieval authors provide us in terms of categories. It is now very common to make a distinction between king sagas, this term used in the Middle Ages in Iceland, and Íslendinga sögur. These are the sagas of the Icelanders, the best represented subgenre, also known as family sagas in English, and this group largely deals with doings and happenings in Icelandic families during the period from the settlement of the Iceland in the second half of the 9th century until the time Iceland converted to Christianity in about 1000 and slightly after this. So in the 18th and 19th century, it was not the most popular genre. This is a rather later development. In the 19th century, it was more popular to deal with legendary sagas, especially in the Romantic movement. This is, however, the richest of these subgenres presented here because we have an unparalleled insight into Icelandic society, or at least into the way later Icelanders represented or thought about what society was like a couple of decades or centuries before. You also need to make a difference in comparison to samtíðarsögur, the contemporary sagas, which are called like this because they deal with people and events that are near contemporary with the age of the writers themselves. So most of these sagas were written in the 13th century, some of them a little later too, and they deal with people from, let's say, the recent past in Iceland. Here we can also mention the most significant saga writer of this category, Sturla Þórðarson, between 1214 and 1284, himself participating or at least observing some of the events he writes about in his sagas. So because we have this chronological aspect when discussing possible classifications for the stories, we also need to take into account the fornaldarsögur already mentioned. It's not only chronological here, the distinction, it is also ethnical, because these sagas, they deal with people and events, let's say, from the prehistory of Scandinavia, so before Iceland was settled in about 870, whereas the Íslendinga sögur, they deal with events and people from the settlement age until the conversion, and the other category with events from the 12th and especially the 13th century up until Iceland became a part of the Norwegian state in 1264. All three of them, so the legendary the family, and the contemporary sagas, they have a Icelandic perspective on time and on history, and they do not have a counterpart in Norwegian literature from this age, while, as we have seen, the sagas of the kings probably stem from a Norwegian influenced environment, and in the context of historical writings and miracle stories about Norwegian kings in both Latin and vernacular languages. This is also supported by the existence of a lot of skaldic verse written both by Norwegians and Icelanders. So besides these very important categories, we can also add here the sagas of the knights, Ridarasogur. So these are basically retellings of popular legends, such as the cycle about Tristan, which were common in continental Europe at the time. They derive mainly from translations of French and Anglo-Norman romances made for the court of the Norwegian king Håkon Håkonarsson. And later they were translated into Icelandic. We can also add here romances with subjects related to the saints' lives, for example, foreign saints mainly, but also some lives of Icelandic bishops for whom sanctity was claimed, some versions of the life of the Virgin Mary, as well as other foreign sources. In this case, many of these works appear to have first been translated into Norwegian and later into Icelandic, and the translations into Icelandic seem to have suffered some modification, some visible modification as well. So this would be it basically. So we make a distinction between king sagas, sagas of the Icelanders, sagas of the ancient times, contemporary sagas, and then also sagas of knights and bishops. To end this short presentation, I am also going to mention the existence of something special found in medieval manuscripts in Iceland, which is the þættir, in plural þættir. This is a short prose tale with mainly a stereotyped plot in which mostly young male Icelanders travel abroad. They usually go to the court of a Norwegian king to gain some material reward or to make themselves known to the world for their exploits. And it often, such a story often includes composing poetry in praise of the king. And then the character returns to Iceland after having gained a lot of honor and material success. The noun in its literal sense means a strand of rope. So transferred to literature, it conveys this notion that it was a part of a larger narrative code. So if you're interested in reading a saga or some sagas of a particular category, I can mention a couple of examples here. So for example, in this category of mythical sagas, we can mention Volsunga saga, so the saga of the Volsungs, Hervarar saga og Heiðreks, the saga of Hervor and Heiðrek, Ragnar saga, Loðbrokar, the saga of Ragnar Shaggypants, Orvar Odd saga, the saga of Arrow Odd, Hrolf saga Kraka, the saga of Hrolf the Póladder, Sturlaug saga Starfsama, the saga of Sturlaug the industrious, or Sorla saga Sterka, the saga of Sorli the strong. Of course, this is only a very small selection with, let's say those which I like particularly. The list is much longer, I assure you. All right, and last but not least, Ørbygja saga, the saga of the inhabitants of Ør, Vopsfirðinga saga, the saga of the weapons fjord, Laxdøla saga, the saga of the Valley of the Salmon, Gisla saga Sursonar, the saga of Gisli Surson, Finnboga saga Rama, the saga of Finnbogi the Strong, Egil saga Skallagrimssonar, probably the best known saga, yeah, the saga of Egil, son of Skallagrim, the bold Grim. Gunnlaug saga Ormstungu, the saga of Gunnlaug Wormtongue, Hravenkel saga Frøyskoða, the saga of Hravenkel, priest of the god Freyr, and Brennu Njol's saga, the saga of burnt Njol, one of the best written sagas in the whole Icelandic literature. Alright, so I hope you found out something new. In the next video I'm going to make on the topic Norse culture, I'm going to discuss a little bit what a saga actually is, so how we can define a saga and what the differences would be in comparison to a modern novel. So stay tuned, follow me, subscribe to my channel, help it grow. Thank you very much for listening. If you have comments regarding this topic, and if you also have particular interests in something related to sagas or Vikings, Old Norse, please write to me, and maybe I will do some research into your particular interests. Thank you very much. All the best.